Hey everyone, and welcome to another term of the Foundation Patreon. My name is Matthew Zickery, and I'm here today with John Park and Daniel Park. And today I'm going to go ahead and walk you guys through continuing on matte surface rendering. Before we go ahead and dive deeper into our actual objects and, seeing how we can kind of add on to them in order to just take them to the next step, I just want to go ahead and just give you this little quick breakdown of how lighting actually works on these objects. And right now we're still just sticking to matte surfaces, so let me go ahead and kind of give you this brief explanation on what's going on. Go ahead and we'll just tint that. So as you guys know, light comes down in a direction. Alright, so if we assume that these are light rays, coming from the sun, they're all going to be parallel to each other. And we have our floor plane. Let me just find something simple, alright. So whether this is the floor or an object, just whatever it is, light's going to hit this, and it's going to bounce back at the same angle, just like the way a mirror works, or if you think of a tennis ball. Really quick. So if you're playing tennis, or if you're just bouncing a tennis ball against, the wall over here, the ball is going to hit the wall, and whatever angle it hits the wall, it's going to bounce back at that same exact angle. So now when we take a look at this, the light rays are going to do the same exact thing. They're going to make contact with this surface right over here. And because it's hitting it at, I don't know, is this like a 60-degree angle or so, it's going to bounce back at that same angle. So essentially what we can do is just take this layer, duplicate it, and that's exactly what's going on with the light rays. So this works for smooth surfaces, and when you think of a smooth surface, that's going to be something really shiny, such as a really shiny car, a mirror, chrome, materials like that. A matte surface, however, on a microscopic level, I'm talking, you can't even see this, its surface isn't actually smooth. And that's what gives it its texture. It's got things going on like, let me just switch the color. So its surface is actually really rough on it. And if you take a piece of sandpaper and sand down, like a car or a piece of wood, what you're actually doing is you're roughing up the surface, causing all these imperfections over here, these impurities. So let's just label this shiny, smooth surface. And this will be a matte surface. So now if we take these same light rays, let's take one at a time, and we're going to keep them at the same angle. So we'll just have it come in here. And we'll just make that side a little bit smaller. Alright, there we go. So now we have the light rays still coming in the same direction, we're just pretending we're on a sunny day out here. And wherever it hits perpendicular to this surface, it's going to bounce back at that degree or at that angle. So what you're gonna see is this right here, you know, it's gonna make contact right at about a 90. This is a little wider. Funny, most of these are the same angles. A little wider as well. So because of that, let's go ahead and we'll switch that up just a little bit. And then one more time, we'll repeat this because it's going to hit that surface. You know, obviously light isn't going to go backwards. Anything that hits this surface right here, it's going to be bounce light or reflected light. But if we're going to have it contact our actual surface, you know, light doesn't really bend like that. It's going to still be, this is just our first pass of light right here. And let me show you what I mean by that. So this light's gonna contact right there. And because it's hitting at a 90 or almost a 90, it's basically gonna bounce right back. So this right here is almost perfect. So that'll be its reflected ray. This right here is bouncing more. Same here. These are all the reflected rays. This is actually going to do something like that. And let me color these a different color just so you can see. So those are all the reflected rays of this rough surface. And what's happening is we're getting this perfect mirror surface that we would have had over here. And it's just really just, you know, dialing it down over here. It's all blending in together. And once again, this is on the microscopic level. So if you're in an airplane looking down at like a mountain valley, it's kind of something similar what you would see. And just go zoom all the way out and you're going to get this diffused light. So let's go ahead now and, you know, apply that onto our objects. Knowing that we're not going to get any type of shininess here. What's shininess? It would be reflectivity. So there's going to be no bright highlights. There's going to be no reflections. So we're not going to see anything back in our objects. So let's stitch that little demo. And that kind of stuff, you don't have to know it like super in depth, but just having that knowledge definitely helps you understand how you're going to render certain objects. So if we had this sphere over here and it was actually an 8-ball, we would first render it in a matte surface and then we would make it shiny by adding in all the reflections, you know, kind of like a clear coat. And then with that, you get the texture on it, the reflectivity, you get that smoothness that we just described over here. But before we add that clear coat, we have this rough surface, and that's what we're going to work on today. So what we're going to take today is we're going to actually take the objects that we rendered last time. We're going to re-render them out, but this time we're actually going to turn them into objects. And there's 3 key things I want you guys to focus on while doing this. So before we actually go and start combining shapes and all that kind of stuff, we're going to keep all the shapes simple. We're going to focus on adding in cut lines. Still got that awesome yellow. Value graphics. And I'll show you guys how to deal with texture. We're not going to go too crazy into the texture, but just giving you an understanding of how that previous lesson applies to it. And that's kind of like where the mountain valley relation will come in, and I'll show you that. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to render this bad boy out. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and render out these shapes just first in their basic geoforms. So for those of you who haven't seen the past digital demo regarding rendering basic geoforms, this is kind of just a sped up version of that. This is going at right now 4 times the speed of the recording. I believe it took about just an hour total while I was doing these. And you can see what I'm doing right now is I already had my shapes laid out, and I had them laid out in the proper perspective, got a nice composition that I wanted for you guys. And now I'm creating some masks. That way when I start to render the objects in all their different sides, I can have just a simple mask, like what you can see I did right there, is I toss it in as a clipping mask. So I can be as sloppy as I want as long as I have these essential masks to begin with. So it doesn't matter what value we're going to assign them. We're going to take care of all the shading later. I like to group my objects as well, so that way I can have my cube separate from the sphere and the cylinder as well as the cone. What I like to do for the cylinder is I'll go ahead and I'll do the top ellipse, and then using those guides I'll go ahead and I'll do the sides, and that way I can have it perfectly parallel to the top. Then I just duplicate the top ellipse and I'll stretch it just so it's a little bit wider, and I can get rid of my guide marks again. Merge the bottom and the side, and then I can have the top as separate. That way when I light it from the top, I don't have to worry about re-cleaning the mask. So you can see right there, side separate. I'm duplicating my group, and I'm gonna just kind of use the ellipse that I have right now for the bottom of my cone. Just trying to match it up a bit. And then for the cone, I don't use a separate, I guess, group or layer for the top, because right now, it's just a pointed top. So essentially all that you're really looking at is just the side. And obviously we're not doing the bottom since we don't see it. And I'll just use a different value so it all stands out. So that's our basic shapes composition right now. Everything is a separated mask. Let's go ahead now and just clean up some of our layer namings and plot in our shadows. So once again, this isn't a plotting shadow tutorial, but I'm just determining the angle right now for my light. So as you can see, it's coming from the front left based off of those angles for the shadow. And then I'm determining that that's where my sun sits. It's sitting at this, like, I don't know, we could say about like 45-degree angle or so. And these are just my guides. Now, as Scott Robertson says, we're just going to connect the dots. I'm sure I already did a shout out, but if not, shout out to Scott Robertson. You guys really should pick up How to Render. That book just, I mean, it covers everything that it needs to. Like, it goes way more in depth than this, and it goes into the hows and all that. So really get that book if you don't have it. Also comes with a bunch of video tutorials as well of Scott doing, his demos. So back to this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a different value than we did in our previous term. We're going to go with a darker base. And we're just using our halfway to black formula. And then the side will just be a little, in between those two. Just determining base colors right now. This time I did not leave the cylinder pink. Inside joke for those that saw the previous demo. Alright, cool. So let's see if we can just organize this a bit and then go ahead and start rendering on top of these now. So what we'll do is we'll get our shadows plotted a little bit better. Figure out the back corner of that cube. That way we could find exactly where the side of the shadow is going back there. It's all just guesstimating. Alright, so it also looks like we're going to have a little bit of overlap on our sphere from our cube's cast shadow, and we'll plot that in a little bit. So right now, just continuing with our sphere. In the cylinders, I usually do it in two parts. I'll kind of do it like it's a flat object first, and then I'll hit the top after, and that way you can kind of shave away. And then also, you know, add on top of. Just kind of using Photoshop to skew it in there. Once again, this is all guesstimation. And our cone, kind of envisioning where that point would be, and then just connect it to the sides where the core shadows are. Alright, cool. So that should do it right now just for the cast shadows. And let's go on to the actual shapes. Once we get the sphere cast shadow plotted real quick, just use our pen tool, and then we're going to mask it onto the sphere itself, and just lower it so we can actually see it. Yeah, sorry that it looks like I have like a little nervous twitch going on. Like I said, this video sped up 4 times. So essentially, right there, I'm also just plotting in a cast shadow from the sphere onto the cylinder. Once again, I was just like kind of sketching it in loosely. Use our pen tool and just match it up. But yeah, we're taking 1 hour of content and tossing it down into 15 minutes. So don't feel free, like, you know, don't feel bad that you guys are spending too long on this phase, because this is going to set you up for your actual object planning phase. If you have this part messed up, which you'll see I have to make some like corrections later on, but it's really just going to slow you down in the long run. Alright, turn our guides off. And then since we determined that the light's going to be from the right, I'm just going to shade the background a little bit just for some, you know, just illustration aesthetics. And here we go. First, we're getting in some reflected light from the ground. It can't be stronger than your light source, and also can't be brighter than what's reflecting onto it. So if you have it sitting on the black surface, then black wouldn't reflect onto it at all. If it's sitting on the white surface, it'll be brighter than this gray surface it's on. We'll do the same thing for the left side, just kind of going back and forth with it, make sure that it's not overpowering. And you'll notice that that's how I work as well. I go back and forth. I like to go all the way in, like really strong, and then dial it down. That way I could see the extreme effect. We're going to plot in this core shadow real quick. That's where the light is tangent. I'm going to kind of erase back into it. And once again, just work back and forth. And then you just want to keep gradating it to the point of the highlight. And you'll see that I'll touch this one back up too after we get through all of these. So we're going to get in some of that reflected light. Obviously the cast shadow right now is way too strong coming in from the cube, and we'll take care of that later as well. We just need to make sure that we have our main basis down, especially because if your object is going to change shapes a little bit, then you don't want to go too crazy in this phase and render the perfect matte surface if, you know, it's going to have little divots and whatnot later. So what you can see I'm doing here is I'm kind of showing you how the shadow is going to condense. And when you look at this cylinder, when you're looking at it dead on, that's how many dissections you can see if we equally divided it, and you can see how much it starts condensing. It starts getting really tight, you know, at the ends. And it kind of looks like right now that it's in perspective. So that's the distance right there. And that same distance that you would see is covering up almost 3 sections right there on the left.
So that's how much that you're really going to get, condensed when you start wrapping around. And this is just a quick little dia. And that would be like a divoted surface, and you can kind of see right now it's looking like it's wrapping around. So I didn't want to get too deep into that, but just wanted to, kind of mention it. So that way when you guys render these round objects, or, if you ever put any type of, labels or just sections on these, like equal sections, you know how much it's going to start turning when you start getting to those edges. So we found our core shadow, get a little bit of reflected light in there. I'm going to cheat this cone by using the perspective warp tool in Photoshop, which saves my life every time. And we don't have to worry too much about the bottom because it's going to be hidden. And when you guys do your objects, you can feel free to do them individually, or you can put them in an arrangement like this. And, sometimes you have the opportunity to hide a little bit of them, but, it's a little bit of a sacrifice for what could be a better composition at times. Alright, still trying to be a little bit neat with my layers. When I start getting into the object portion, it's, all hands on deck. You don't have to be as clean anymore. Just depends on your amount of OCD. Right now we're getting a little bit of ambient occlusion. I'll just duplicate the entire shape and kind of nudge it down like 1 or 2 pixels. I'm going to just turn my canvas for the sphere real quick. And obviously it'd be the darkest at the point of contact with the surface. Same thing for the cylinder. And the cone. Alright, cool. So now that we got our ambient occlusion in, let's go ahead and work on our cast shadows. And same kind of concept, the further that the shadow is away from the object, the lighter it's going to get. Like, it's not going to be too light, because once again, we are working with sunlight, so it's going to stay fairly sharp. But I did kind of like blur it out a little bit. Kind of erasing some of that cast shadow from our sphere, since if 2 shadows are overlapping, you're not really going to get that kind of layered effect unless it's at the edge or it's really coming from multiple light sources. And we'll take care of that as well in a little bit. There we go. A little bit darker to the object, lighter further away. And then I'll duplicate it, Gaussian blur it, and then toss on a mask in between each of them, so that way I can have a little bit of a blurred edge and sharper. And that's just my personal aesthetic for how this is. Just taking the smudge tool right now and just playing around with this core shadow, seeing if I can soften it up a little bit. And I think that's about to do it. So the 3 things I just want to talk about that we're going to go into are cut lines, value graphics, as well as texture. We're going to start first with the cube on the left, which we're going to turn into a Rubik's Cube. We're then going to work on to the sphere, which, as you've seen, becomes a baseball. Cylinder becomes a cup, and the cone becomes a cone. Or better yet, a kind of an emergency cone. Okay, so let's go ahead and slow it down now, and we're gonna slow this down to double speed. You know, the whole thing took me about 4 hours to do, so that's why I didn't want to, have you guys sit here for 4 hours just watching me go away at this slowly, and just give you a little bit of a sped up version. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and work on this Rubik's Cube. Just kind of filling in a little bit of this perspective here onto the silhouette shape. Alright, so what I'm showing you guys here right now is kind of something that I actually just developed this, trying to find an easy way to divide a rectangular object into thirds. So I'll just take the X method, and then I'll go diagonal from one section of it, one corner to the midway point, and then I'll kind of just duplicate that by going through the middle. And that gives me a nice, thirds. It's very, very close to a perfect 1/3 section all the way across, which if any of you ever tried plotting a third in perspective can, understand it can be a total pain. You can guess it, but since I'm working with a cube here, which you also have to make sure that you have a perfect cube in perspective, I want to be as close as I can while kind of planning this out. So now that we have our X's, we're going to have to go ahead and carry them on up. So right there will give me half of that right side, left and right. And referencing back over there, we're going to go from one of the corners to our midway point. And right there where it intersects, that's 1/3. And right there when it intersects, that's another third. Kind of a cool pattern too. And this is obviously a 9x9 Rubik's Cube. I will not dare attempt one of those like 20x20 monsters. Alright, so I turn the other one off so it's not too distracting, and then that way we can do the thirds on the side. That way we'll come up with 9 total perfectly divided cubes. Bam. One side. And since I'll most likely be using this later as a mask, I'm just going to come here and kind of clean it up so it touches the edge. You could have clipped it into your side, but I figured this was going to be easiest for me. Alright, so we already have third decided for that left side. We can just carry it over. And then we'll only have to use our formula for the top portion going up and down. Just using the marquee tool to kind of clean it up. Alright, carry over that top section. Alright, so that's the best part about doing one side in perspective. You can just kind of carry all this stuff over. And that way when I do this section right here, I can carry that to the top. Uno and dos. Clean it up. And what's going to happen is these white lines are actually going to become a separation point in our Rubik's Cube. And we're going to have to go ahead and actually render those a little bit, because as you'll see soon, they're both going to get hit by light and have other parts that are in shadow. And that's what's going to give it that kind of cut line appearance that I was mentioning earlier. Alright, there's the top. And then looking at the Rubik's Cube, the reason why I went with this base color is because typically a Rubik's Cube itself will be dark, or black even. And then they just have these little stickers that are tossed on top of them. They have, I think it's like red, white, green, yellow, blue. And I want to say there's one more. Just can't recall it from top. Well, there is one more because there's 6. A cube has 6 sides. But anyway, they're all pretty similar in value. And what I'm showing you here right now is the whole cut line mini lesson. If we take a round object, this is a side view that we're looking at. So pretend that we're looking at like just the side of a toy. These all yellow lines are light rays that hit this object. So if this is getting hit down from a noon kind of approach, and we're going to add just little cut lines here, you have to envision that the sun will hit the corner of the top one, and then the bottom plane will be in a shadow. So right there, it's going to get hit with a light ray. And then right there, it's facing downward, so it should be in a little bit of a shadow. And if we're just going to toss some numbers onto this and use our halfway to black theory, we can kind of just guesstimate, add some ambient occlusion, show it in shadow. It's also a tighter area, so it'll be a little darker. Light is parallel, so it's going to be halfway of that. But now we're going to get some bounce light to that top surface, and now the surface facing up is going to be darker. So it reverses and flips itself. Luckily, we don't really have any cut lines on the bottom of an object on this one. But you can kind of envision how the light is actually going to hit the Rubik's Cube on these corners. So what I did is I just duplicated it so that way I can have it separated. And now I can lock transparency and paint within them while staying in the lines. I decided just to make an overall mask for the cube. That way I don't have to go in and clean all those up. So when we're looking at this left side, because the light is coming from the top left, the top corners of these cubes are going to get hit. Not too much action going to happen on the right side, but we'll deal with that in a bit. Now looking at the top plane, the back side, which is the one that we're looking at, is going to get hit. The one that's closer to us, which is facing the other way, will be the darker one. And I promise it'll make more sense when we start zooming in a little bit and kind of cleaning it up. So you can see that that highlighted surface belongs to the left side of these. Or I should say the right side of each cube. And then the top corners are going to get hit with a little bit of light. Bottom corner, which is, it's like an imperfection, a little bevel, will be in shadow. And then you'll even get like a little bit of specularity too on these corners. And I'm sure as you notice too, the demo that I'm doing isn't 100%, matte objects. They do have a little bit of specularity into them, and that's what we're going to add just in a little bit after we get the base of this object kind of, transitioned from its geoform to an actual object. So right now just kind of hinting in that highlight. Haven't gone too strong on it yet. Just cleaning up some of these corners. This is really a patience game. So we're just going to darken most of this over here because the side is in shadow, so light isn't really doing too much. You can argue that there may be a little bit of bounce, you know, hitting that section, but it's not going to be great at all. Looks like I had a little bit of issue earlier with just the cut line, so I went ahead and I just smudged it downward so I can make it meet the end. Let's see if we can kind of just bounce a little bit of light into there. See, I saved you guys the trouble of watching this in real time. Alright, just kind of offsetting that a little bit so we can kind of get more of the highlight interaction. That way we have a good separation of our shadow side versus our highlight side for these. They're not cut lines, but they're actual, you know, separations of these blocks. And that's what allows you to actually rotate each cube. So then also get to know your object whenever you're rendering it out. The reason why I say that is because when I start getting in and adding in these stickers, I can easily mess up and, you know, create all the same value sticker. And, you know, say I can actually have one corner that has 3 white stickers, which wouldn't be possible on a real Rubik's Cube because based off its anatomy, each cube has to have a different color on it, or else it'd be impossible to get all colors on one side. You know, imagine if that corner closest to us had 2 yellows and a blue. You could never get both yellows on the same one. So when we start rendering it, we can use different values for each of the colors, and then they're each going to have a different interaction on the shadow and highlight side. And you don't have to, you know, do it perfectly, but it's just stuff that you have to keep in mind so you can avoid those mistakes of having white all around, or, you know, 2 center white pieces on opposite sides. We don't want to be mindless when we're doing this render. Alright, and it looks like we're going to just create our sticker, which it's basically a square with curved edges. I'm going to take one of those and just skew it into perspective. Thank you, Photoshop, you are saving the day. And unfortunately, because each cube on top is slightly skewed, we got to skew each of them. I'm sure the way faster way would have been to make the cube, make all of them, like all 9 once, and then skew that into perspective. Yeah, I decided to do it the hard way, the laborious way. Seeing if I can get away with doing them all. And I just gotta kind of, yeah, looks like I'm gonna just go one by one. Feel free to fast forward, guys. You're gonna see me do this 27 times. But once again, it's just a matter of having patience. I wanted to have a really well rendered out Rubik's Cube in the end. So I made sure to take my time and not, you know, just go halfway for it. I really wanted to make sure that I was gonna render this baby out. Get all the nice speck on it too on the end. And see how good I can make it look just being in black and white. And once again, obviously this cube wasn't perfect and the dissection wasn't, you know, perfect. We didn't plot everything out, but for an estimation, this is pretty damn close. And the reason why I'm doing all these individual is because I want to be able to just quickly alter their value. That way I can just select one, swap the value to whatever I want it to be, move on to the next one. If they were all, one value, say this was a solved Rubik's Cube where the whole top was white, the whole side was yellow, and the other side was red, then no problem, they can all be just in one mass. But because I wanted to make it look unsolved, that's why I have them each as their own individual little sticker. Minor tweaks here and there. Alright, cool. That's going to wrap up that side. It's pretty cool because looking at it from this far back, it looks like an LED cube. Kind of like a Rubik's Cube from the future where each one of these cells has a little battery and it powers a light. So that way you can just be some genius hacker and, impress all your friends by pretending to solve it, but you just have like all the lights change right away. That'd be pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. I would buy one of those. Alright, and it looks like that is gonna wrap it for just tossing these stickers on. Alright, cool. Thanks for sticking with me through that, guys. Let's go ahead and have a little bit more fun now with this. So we're gonna go ahead and just kind of make sure that all transparency is locked on these. I'm gonna group those so I don't lose them, because that would be a pain to find those 27 layers. And yeah, now let's go ahead and start switching up values. Even though this is white, we are still in a lit environment, so we're gonna have to change the value even for the white ones. And if you wanted to be all technical, then they still would have a 1, 2, and 3. So everything in the shadow side has to be hit with a shadow value. If you're using a white sticker on the shadow side, if it's a value 2, halfway to black, it's now going to be a value 6. Sorry, I had to do the math there. Now, if it's a value 4, halfway to black, there's 6 steps in between. That means 3 plus 4 is 7. And then right there, because I am using it on, looks like a screen mode, we do get a little bit of transition for the original reflected light that we had in there. Looks like I'm playing between screen and multiply. And then what I like to do too is after just, selecting some of these and switching the colors is I'll just start using levels layer and I'll just eyeball it. Beep, beep, boop, boop. It's like I'm playing Bop It now. See? Reverse LED Rubik's Cube. I'm telling you guys, it's the future. So what I mentioned earlier about all the values in the shadow side also applies for all values on the highlight side. If we have a white sticker on our highlight side, it's going to be a value 2. If we're working with a mid color, that's its local color is like a value 4 or 5, then it would stay that natural color and value on the highlight side. Just darkening some of these up. I don't want them too bright on that left side because I want to make sure that the top shows as a highlight. So there are the stickers, and we'll come in a bit too after we get a head start on some of these and just add a little more spec onto this object. So, feel free to also play with your object. Just it doesn't have to be perfectly brand new. What you can see I'm doing here is I'm actually just kind of making it look like it's a little bit used. Maybe some of these stickers or someone tried peeling them off. They tried cheating and actually peeling it and putting it onto a different cube. So that's kind of that texture chalk brush mask that I applied there. This one right here, maybe let's see if we can bend one of the corners. We'll just erase into it and then repaint it. And all you really have to do is just erase some of it and add a little shadow under it, and you'll have a bent corner. The sticker itself doesn't have too much thickness, but that's why you just have to add a little bit of a shadow to show that it's lifted. Just a little bit of that side highlight. Shaded the underside. I'm just going in with this airbrush I'm going to erase on top. And I'm basically doing this for my own sanity. Like, I just want to have some fun with this, even if it is just a simple boring Rubik's Cube. How else can we play with it? Maybe this side we'll take it and we'll kind of bend it so it's a little more peeled. And it's cool because the light's hitting it, so that's actually going to affect our cast shadow as well. And once again, why am I doing this? Just to have fun. You don't have to. But typically everything in my room, nothing is brand new. Everything has some sort of destruction to it. Just some wear and tear, a little bit of usage. So I'm kind of wrapping that sticker. And it's funny, that word story, because when you look at something like this, it actually adds story to this piece. Even though there's no character or narrative or anything, it's just having this kind of lets you imagine and envision your own kind of story. Like, oh, maybe this character was peeling them off, putting them back on, it's been used a lot, the dog could have chewed it, so I had some punctures or whatever you want to say. And it just lets you just use your imagination and add a little bit of story to the narrative. Cool, that was just popping out a little bit too much for me. Looks like the one right next to the one that's lifted is also just completely peeled off. We lost that one. Alright, cool. I think we're going to wrap up the Rubik's Cube pretty soon. Just little adjustments here and there. Alright, just doing some layer organization again. Some of these are popping out just a tad bit bright. Alright, so kind of envisioning now our original lighting, and where a light ray would hit and light the sticker that's peeling off, that's where it would cause a cast shadow. So I'm just going to guess right here at this 1/3 mark. And then if we just erase a little bit out of the top, we can kind of get what we're looking for. I'm just going to smudge those two cast shadows together. Alright, so that basically does it for the Rubik's Cube. Let's go ahead and just see if we can add a little bit of just some specularity to this and kind of get a little bit of material play on it, just because it's boring in this all matte view. So now, without being all, super specific and strategic with the planning, we're just going to go ahead and we're just going to take a brush and just hit some of these corners. And I'm just doing them on a full 100%. And the reason why that's okay is because we can just come in after with a mask and clean it up. So make sure only to hit the corners that would have this kind of speck light. And thankfully this time I did these on a separate layer, so that way I'm not trying to erase these corners. And then we're just gonna erase where the line is again in the middle. Kind of repeating what we did earlier, but don't have to be too specific. Just hitting the top. And then also, once you have these kind of carved out and on separate layers, you can control the value of each of them. So even if you use 100% white just to get it in, just like we did for our objects, we'll just first get in the shape, clean it up, show it where we want with a mask, and then we can actually alter the value by using a lock transparency layer. Alright, and there we go, using the mask to reveal it. Forgot to get in this front corner. And if you notice too, the light is almost perfectly parallel with the side of our cube. And that's the reason why it's so dark over there. And now that we have that, we can just show it and reveal it now where we want. And after we do the corners, we can do the whole surface. Making some parts brighter. Hitting the corners a little bit more, since we can argue that that imperfection is, facing a lot closer to the sunlight. And you'll notice this on a lot of objects too. Take these toys or just, whatever manufactured goods and hold them to the light and see, kind of investigate what's going on with them. Alright, so right now I'm playing with the color dodge brush. It doesn't look like it's working for me. So what I'll do instead is use a color dodge layer. Do the whole thing black first and then put it on color dodge, because it reacts different when it's on a black layer first. And then you can kind of just brush in this speck. Have some nice material play on it. It's alright if you overshoot it, because we can just erase it after. Alright, let's find the selection of our cube, invert it, so we can delete that. And then now that we kind of have the effect we want, we can just use a mask on top of that and reveal it where we want. Or you could just erase sides of it. So obviously we don't want this kind of specular highlight on our shadow side, and that's what we're going to control very soon. Just take a selection of it so we can work cleanly. And by the way, I spent the most time on that object. It'll go a lot by quicker for these other objects. Alright, so back to our sphere. We're going to turn this into a baseball. And I just wasn't too excited with the rendering on this sphere, so I'm going to go ahead and just darken it up a little bit. We can now take our cast shadow and kind of blend it into the shadow itself, since we wouldn't have that harsh transition. Just going to soften it up, work it back and forth. Since the blur tool wasn't working, same thing with a smudge, I tried the Gaussian blur. And now is when I'm just going to start painting on top of it, since I find that a lot easier. And once again, the baseball isn't perfectly matte. It does have a little bit of speck onto it as well. So you'll see me add that in towards the later half of the baseball. But right now we just really want to get that round appearance to show. So go a little bit brighter with the highlight. Transition from the light side to the dark side, as well as our cast shadow. And it's looking a lot more like a ball, as you could see. Let's do a little color dodge trick. Black background, color dodge layer. See if we can get in some speck. Just using the basic soft brush, nothing fancy. Just gotta lower the opacity because when it's on white, it'll be really, really bright. And don't worry if it takes you guys a little bit to get the speck just right. You know, you'd rather spend your time and do it right than rush it and just be really bright or, you know, look like a super Photoshop color dodge effect. You do not want that. And then what's interesting is that we have this little bit of just like, you know, shine on our ball. When we add texture to it later, you get that nice kind of contrast of materiality to it. So just kind of smudging around, seeing if that'll do anything for us. Maybe we can smudge it and then add a mask on top of that. See what kind of effect that'll give us. And this is exactly what I mean while you want to make sure that you have your object rendered to your likings before you start switching it up and adding stuff onto it. You know, imagine if we go ahead and we just complete the whole entire baseball, but it didn't really look like a good sphere to begin with. Then we'd have to go in and rework that, and it's just too much back and forth. So what I'm doing real quick, and I wanted to make sure to show you guys, is I'm going to go ahead and create a custom brush. And the reason for this custom brush is I just wanted to save me some time in Photoshop for doing the stitching. So I'm just going to take one line and kind of have it go out at an angle. And I'm just going to add a little bit of a hole at the end of it, and that's where the stitch kind of, you know, fits in the ball. The thread, that is. And then after we have it, I'm going to duplicate it and move it down. And you could definitely paint this like, you know, one by one if you wanted to, but since it's a repeated object, I thought creating a brush would be a lot quicker for me. Move it downwards, just nudge it, then bring it forward to, you know, just a decent stitching that I'd want for my baseball. Edit, define brush preset, and let's play with the settings now and see if we can kind of get something like what we want. And if you use the pen tool, you can have that brush selected and hit enter, and it'll stroke it to your path. So that doesn't work too good for perspective or at the corner of round object, well, corner of round objects, sorry, at the edges or sides of round objects when it starts wrapping around. But you could see if we just kind of get in our pen tool to how we want the stitching to follow, it'll give us a huge cheat. And then now we just have to play with sizing. Don't want the stitches too big or too small. And if you have your pen tool selected, just hit the escape button, and that way it'll get rid of that particular I guess path that you have, so you can keep adding more paths like I did right now, having 2 of them. I did just a normal hard brush to get my line, you know, the center fold of the stitch. Seeing if we can warp in that back end a little bit. And it'll take a little bit of work. You know, gotta do one side at a time just to kind of show it wrapping around. And once we have it how we like it, we'll just mask it into our sphere. Working with a pure black right now so I can see what I'm doing. It's funny because each object becomes easier. You know, we went from the hardest Rubik's Cube to a baseball, which still has stitching, so it takes a little bit of work. And then, you know, a coffee cup and a reflective cone. So it's like the opposite of a workout where you're supposed to work like, you know, easy to hard. No, we did hard, so then everything else is just a breeze. Get it over with. Let's see if we can kind of warp in this back end. Alright, and that's really not too bad at all. It obviously is flat right now, so we're going to have to duplicate our stitching and our cut line, because the cut line is basically a baseball. It's, you know, once again, know the anatomy of your object. And you just have these 2 different these 2 materials that come joined together. Kind of look like an 8, and they form this ball, and they're just stitched together. So you have a cut line on top where the stitching meets. So on top, you know, it's facing the light, it'll get a little bit of a highlight. On the underside, it'll get a little bit of a shadow. That'll give the stitch effect. Right now you can see I'm just working in that light on this sphere. Not worried about the actual stitching right now, but just the individual pieces of the material. And once again, if you do the path once and just duplicate it and kind of nudge it around, you can get away without having to repath and re-drip like pen tool the line. Make sure you have log transparency on. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just trying to make this a little bit thinner. I'll go ahead and I'll alt click on my layer. That gives me a selection. I will then go ahead and either go to select and then selection and hit contract. Basically it's going to take away a couple pixels. Or if you do a inverse selection, you can hit the delete button a couple times and it kind of deletes a little bit around the edges. So if you're just trying to delete a little bit, it's a nice little trick. And if you guys have any questions at all, feel free to just email me and I'll be happy to help you if any of this stuff isn't making too much sense for you guys. It's MatthewZikri@yahoo.com. Just email me over there. Or if you guys want to hit up the Brainstorm J Park email as well, that works. Alright, so now we're working with the stitching. Once again, anatomy of the baseball is this is red stitching, so the value is going to be somewhere in the middle. It's not going to be, too dark or too bright. At least anatomy on this baseball I'm doing is red stitching. Kind of did that little cheat which I told you. Invert the selection so I can delete a few pixels. We're going to have the light on top with shadow on bottom. And then it's going to reverse a little bit as we get to the opposite end. And you can see me playing with it too inside the shadow side itself. And it just doesn't work too much out. So we're gonna kind of blend it in with the shadow in a little bit. Always take a step back and zoom out. See how it's looking as an overall. Then we can zoom back in. Call me crazy, but each one of these strings, threads, they have a little shadow under it. So I'm just quickly going over this, we don't have to go too crazy, but adding them in really will give your object another layer and level of depth, just in its whole believability and realism. Lowering the opacity a little bit. And then they all also fit within these holes that were, basically created when it was punctured with a needle. So I'm going to just add a little bit of a highlight on some of them. And what's crazy too is where the stitching goes in, it also raises the surface just because of the nature of how it's, embedded into the material. So that's going to create a shadow that kind of mimics the contour of the actual material itself. And we'll add that really soon. Still wasn't too happy with this angle, so I'm just going to try and push it back a little bit more, while being careful to make sure it still lines up with its joint, I guess, stitch on the opposite end. And you saw I had to do it twice because we duplicated that layer earlier, so that's just something to keep in mind. It'd be a lot quicker if we did that from the beginning, so we wouldn't have to do it twice. But it's starting to get there. It's starting to look like a baseball. Alright, just darkening the whole shadow area. And this right here is the little shadow I told you guys about, where it kind of raises the surface. And you'll notice this on some baseballs if you pick them up, that if you put your finger over it, you'll actually feel this bump. It's because the thread is pulling on the material. Just duplicating it to the top area. And now if we select the soft brush and then hit enter, obviously you gotta decide the size. Just lower it a little bit. And it's minor, but that helps so much. It's not even funny how much it helps. And you'd want that to be under your thread as well. So since we have a little bit of a shadow, on top of it would be a little bit of a highlight. Since you can't have, a shadow without a light somewhere. Or is it the opposite? You can't have light without a shadow. Ooh. But yeah, I'd say that's coming out pretty nicely for the baseball. Alright, so right there at the top, we just made sure our flow was all the way on. It's going to work a little bit more with the color dodge, see if we could push it even further. Try not to blow it out, but just trying to, get that round kind of nice highlight on this object. And since we have our original sphere, we can just use our clipping mask and work cleanly within it without having to keep erasing out. So now we're just darkening those threads where it just wasn't looking too good, being too bright. And sorry guys, I know this isn't the most exciting demo ever, but hopefully it's a little bit useful. We're going to create another brush real quick for the texture on our baseball. If we just take our round brush and dab different sizes everywhere, we can once again define the brush preset, and this will give us a texture kind of, just dotted appearance. That's what it looks like straight off the bat. Add some scatter to it, a little bit of spacing, angle jitter, as well as size jitter. And you can really get just different size dots everywhere. Make sure to save it. And let's now just brush them all over the baseball. We're going all over. You can make the brush a little bit smaller and bigger as well. And I don't want it too hard, so I'm just going to blur it just a tad bit. And basically just like our cut lines, if we duplicate it, if the highlights are on top, it looks like it's coming out of the ball like a pimple. If the highlight's on bottom, it looks like it's a divot. And we're just going to lower the opacity, kind of get it somewhere where we want it, and then just add a mask on top of it. And right now, texture. The way that it works is you see texture right before the core shadow. And the reason being is because that's where the light is hitting tangent to these little holes on the surface, these little like imperfections. And kind of think of it like a mountain range, kind of like our earlier, explanation in the very beginning where the surface is bumpy. It's only going to hit those peaks, and that's where you're going to see this highlight. And given you could see texture on an entire object, but it's going to be most prominent right there before the core. Alright, baseball, let's call it done. Move on to our cup. We're now just going to go ahead and reverse the top. We're going to make it dark because it's now an actual, a hole. It's a container now instead of an actual lid. And let's see if we can just add a little bit of a rim to this. Just finding the surface, selecting it, and adding a stroke. And you can usually find that under File, Edit, and then go to Stroke. Make sure that you have it set onto the inside, so that way we're not adding to the outside of this. And now that I have it light, I can once again just add a mask, or just the lock transparency, and work it how I want it to. Envisioning where this highlight would be. Once again, our cup will have a little bit of a speck as well. So I'm kind of envisioning where the bright part would be on this object. And be sure to look at reference. If you don't have the object itself, go to Google, look it up, and just see how it reacts. And look up more than one too. So that way you can kind of get an idea for how this object's interacting with the light. Because this is more of a reflective speck surface, I'm going to have this interesting kind of almost reflection, you could say, in here, where some parts are going to be brighter, some will be a little shinier. It's looking very boring right now, but when we start getting in these bright portions, it's really going to help pop it out. So you can also see that the stroke that we did on top helps give a thickness to our cup. That way it's not paper thin. Alright. Now it looks like we're working with a screen mode. See if we can get a little bit of speck on this. So for specular objects, you're not going to have a soft transition from a highlight to a shadow. You're going to get reflections, which are going to be more crisp typically. Just working it back and forth, seeing where it looks best. You know, we'll have to erase it from the top as well, so that way it's only sitting on the surface we want it to. And we're starting to get there. I was going to try and paint that in, but I decided it was much easier just to find our selection. And that's starting to look a lot shinier now. And you notice I'm only adding it on the rim, wherever I have it on the sides as well. Just because, you know, it's probably reflecting something on that surface, and it's hitting both sides of it. The far side as well as that front side. Just trying to make sure it makes a little bit of sense. Alright, we're looking good. Let's clean up some of those layers. Kind of hit the whole top with a little bit more of a highlight. And once again, that's going to help us transition from this, you know, matte surface, this rough surface, onto this, you know, smoother, shinier surface. Make sure that we just have that. It's going by a lot quicker now, guys. Helpful planning definitely helped us go a lot smoother as well. You know, if we planned a Rubik's Cube from the get-go and kind of mapped out all stickers at once for each side, it would have went by a lot quicker. But I knew the effect that I was looking for on this cup, and that's what kind of helped it just go by a lot smoother. Bring some of that core back. Just still working it back and forth. And when you guys select your objects, I want to make sure that you just select something not too difficult. If you take a notice at all these objects, they're all relatively just simple shapes. Cube, sphere, cylinder, cone. If there's anything added to it, which will actually be in the cup right here, I'm just going to add a handle. But they're all very basic shapes. You don't want to go too like complex and compound from the get-go. Just make sure it's something that we can render out, so when we understand our complex and compound like shapes and how they interact with each other, it'll be a lot easier. Thought it'd be cool to add in, you know, a little bit of a graphic on this. And instead of doing a value graphic, this is actually going to be kind of engraved into the cup itself. So we took the text tool, rasterized it. I just hit the brush tool, clicked on the layer, and then hit enter, and that'll rasterize a text layer for you. And then if you go to transform and hit warp, you can use an arch. And that's what helped me wrap this around the coffee cup. So first I'm determining the actual value for the engrave. I'm going to make sure that it kind of fits within our cylinder's lighting scenario. And then we're going to duplicate it and just move it around so that way I can get the actual stroke right here, which will allow me to just paint directly in it without having to manually go in and perfectly copy the letters. I can just use the stroke, throw it on the mask, paint in one side dark, one side light. That right there isn't working, so let's do it again. Make sure you have lock transparency on. Alright, yeah, let's just go ahead and stroke it again. Just a 1 pixel. Alright, there we go. Now it's working. So now just kind of picturing where the light is hitting this on the edges. Because it's in an engraving, the light will be on the side that is inside of the object. If we had it as a shadow, then that will look like it's coming outside of the cup. So you have to make sure that your light is hitting the right side of this kind of negative space on the cup. Just keep zooming in and out. Alright, and then let's make sure to add a handle onto this bad boy. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the pen tool and kind of design out this handle, very basic and simple. Stroke it. And if I duplicate that and just move it over, it's kind of just a cheap way of just getting the depth in this. And I don't have to be too careful because it's in the back of the cup. Just make sure that I can see the top of it because it is below the horizon line. And then I'll keep the front one that we see as a separate layer so that way it can be the side of our handle. And I can use that while rendering this. Quickly lasso that out so I can fill it in. See if we can clean up that corner. And feel free to use whatever method you guys want. I like to just work as clean as I possibly can, which is why you see me using the lasso tool, the pen tool, all of these masks and locks. They're all just for me to cleanly work within my shape. Remember, you want to use a tool that gets you your desired effect. Alright, now that's all just the base color. We can add in just a little bit of reflected light at the bottom. And this whole thing is in shadow, so we wouldn't get too much on it. So once again, keeping it very basic, just a cylinder with a little handle on it. It's not like I'm doing even a water bottle, which just has way too much complexion in it, from its shape to the actual material itself. You know, if you guys want to try something simple like a Coke can, go ahead. It's going to be a little shinier than this, but it's still very basic. Since right now we're only focused on materials. Alright, cool. So looks like we're doing pretty good with the cup. Looks like I went back for another color dodge layer just to see if I can get in the final spec highlight here. Bam. Alright, don't overkill it, Matt. But yeah, I think that helps a lot. Just brighten up the text. And cool, let's see if that's gonna wrap it up for our cup. Same thing that we did with our cube. We don't want it too harsh of a cast shadow from our baseball. So just kind of blurred it out a little bit. Just making sure that's lining up with the bottom and just darkening where it's actually covering a little part of that C. I'm not sure what happened there, but let's find that layer so we can nudge it back over. Looks like it accidentally just got moved over and nudged a bit. If you use the arrow tool, you can just right click and it'll show you all the layers under that point. So that's what I'm using right now to determine where this mishap is. Is it the highlight that got nudged over, or was it an actual stroke? That's what you got to find out. Looks like for us it was a highlight that accidentally got nudged over. Alright. Baseball, Rubik's Cube, and cup. Lastly, let's do our cone. So it looks like this one's going to be really quick. There's about less than 10 minutes left, meaning this probably took about 15, no more than 20 minutes in real time. Just going to chop off the top. And when you look at these red cones, they kind of just have a top with a hole in it. That's kind of what we're going to imitate right now. So what I did is I just took the ellipse tool and I'm just inverting a black one on top of it, and you get an instant hole. Just work within those masks. And essentially the reason why I used a kind of mid-tone value is I'm just kind of going for a red value for our cone itself. That way we can get these white reflected strips onto it, and it'll actually look like a white reflected strip. Imagine doing that on the white cone, it's not going to read too well. I'm seeing right now if we can cheat using our warp tool that we used earlier. Hit it on arch, just bring it down. And it kind of works, but not really what I'm looking for. Almost there, but I think I'm going to decide to actually, we're going to give it one more shot by just making the rectangle smaller. I just didn't like how it was coming to too fast of a point. So I'm just going to take the nearest ellipse, which is the cup, and then I'm going to make it smaller. That'll help me just map this out. Then we can take our graphic itself and just erase into it now. Cool, let's do the same thing for the bottom. And this is just a way to get a nice clean mask. So I'm picturing that this reflected strip was added on top of the cone, so then we can add a little bit of highlight on top of it too. Just playing with the layer ordering to see if we can get our material rendering on top of this working. Looks like it didn't do too well for me. Alright, that's not bad. It's a good base. And once again, I don't really like working with pure white, so we'll just dial that down, which will allow us to hop on a color dodge layer and bring in reflectivity back. It's much easier to make something dark look shiny. You see me just working back and forth, trying to get a nice line for this. A little bit of trial and error. Now I'm just using the brush tool and I'm holding shift to get a perfectly straight line. I went ahead and I made a selection of just the reflected parts. That way we can make those more reflective. And I would say that's looking pretty good. I added a stroke, so now I can add in a highlight to this. And then I masked it off to make sure it's within the cone. Just dim the top down a little bit. Alright, there it is. There's a stroke, masked in, clipped it in as well. Just deleted the outside pixels. And then now I can just show in the highlight side where this is. So cool. Bottom of the cones also have a little bit of like a flat surface. That way they don't fly around in the wind. And lucky for us, we don't see too much of it. So we're just going to add it in, dupe it, and just show a little bit of the side. Sweet. Most of that's in shadow from the sphere. And let's take an overall look. I think this is looking pretty good. Now, just for illustration's sake, we're going to take our background and kind of blur in that back edge so it doesn't call for too much attention. Can just brighten up the front part a little bit. I wanted to see if I can actually make the cone a little bit bigger, just because it's not really that small. So just seeing if we can budge it just a little bit bigger. I'd say it's a little bit better. Minor stuff like that, it's completely fixable. Alright, a few touch-ups here and there. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this demo, by the way. It's, like I mentioned earlier, it's not the most exciting thing to sit through, but it's definitely, I feel at least, some useful information on how to render some of these objects and get that realistic understanding. So that way, whenever we're painting this on the fly, you know, we're typically never going to paint like this, but at least now we have the knowledge and information to go ahead and include this kind of stuff whenever we're painting, you know, some sci-fi interior. You're going to know where some cut lines are going to be, you know, have some highlights, how the certain objects are going to sit on top of each other and interact with each other. So it's really good to slow it down while you can and just follow along. Alright, and I think that's just about it. Let's see if we can just darken that a little bit. Can't play with the ground too much because of our cast shadows, but just brighten it up a little bit. And looks like we're going to call that done. Great, so thanks for sticking through this whole thing, guys, those of you who made it through. Let's go ahead now and talk about homework. I want you guys to go ahead and do 4 objects, a cube or some type of box, a sphere, a cylinder, and a cone, and just do some basic object rendering. You can select what I've done and follow along if you're not too comfortable with going on your own, or you can create your own objects, you know, based off of reference that you find. You can put them all into a canvas like I did and kind of having a little arrangement, or you can actually just do them as individual objects. Be sure to upload them to the blog and look forward to seeing you guys' submissions. Thanks so much, guys.